All right, we are live now after a little bit of Google Hangouts technical difficulties. We made it, I think. I am joined tonight with Martin and Beau, and I believe Adam Culp is also on the way. So, how are things tonight, guys? How are you? How are you doing, Martin?
I'm doing great. Just been busy at work and everything, but other than that, doing great.
That's good. It's always good to be busy. And how about you, Beau?
Things are going pretty good.
Cool. You got a nice big whiteboard on the side of you, so that's
I do.
awesome.
I love my whiteboards.
Yeah, I need to get some more from this office. So yeah. Okay, so tonight we're talking about Chapter 3 of Clean Code by Robert Martin. So we're going to be talking about functions and everything you possibly wanted to know about functions and methods and so on and so forth. Is there anything that you found particularly interesting that you want to kick off with? We'll start with you, Beau.
um, Number of arguments. I was kind of surprised by how much effort was put into describing the number of arguments you should have or should not have,
Yeah.
and the fact that there are names for the different types of acceptable argument lengths.
Yeah, like a monadic, dyadic function, and yeah.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that. It's stuff that I've heard off and on in the past, but like 2 pages really of the number of arguments and why you would use just one versus two, and
Yeah,
what you're doing if there's one versus two.
it felt like it was, 20 pages, really. I
Yeah.
was just like, it just kept going on and on about the number of arguments, and I was like, I mean, I get it. I can understand this. Like, I try to keep the number of arguments to a method down. I try not to have too many, but I don't really see the need of being so serious about it, right? Like, I feel like I've never seen a method and been like, you know what, this method is terrible. It takes 4 arguments, therefore I'm not going to use this. If it took 4 arguments, it's because that's how many it required to get the job done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that interesting too, but yeah, I mean, I get what he's saying. It's kind of the same advice that I've given people for, when you're building up an object or something and you've got 15 required parameters. It is possible it's saying something to you. It's telling you, you're doing too many things.
Hmm.
I can see that, but just as general advice of saying you should have only zero functions or zero arguments to your function is ideal. Like, that's the best function in the world. I'm like, well, I don't know if I'd go that far. So yeah,
Yeah.
that was interesting. What about you, Martin?
Yeah, also the same as you talked about, and I've seen the talks about this, and I'm still surprised every time by the way he cuts down everything into functions. It's interesting, and I can see the value in using functions as to describe each couple of lines.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. I can also see it being problematic after time. Like, I certainly I favor that pattern as well. Like, I favor taking, making it read well. So I've got methods or functions that are telling me here's what's actually happening. Like, I can read it and it makes sense to me. But at the same time, I don't worry too much about, if I've broken down everything into methods, or if I've extracted everything that I could possibly extract. I don't worry too much about it, but at the same time, I feel like I've personally, over experimentation, over time, like, learned what helps me later on, and I try to apply that to the code that I'm writing. So I don't really have a rule on you know how many lines or how many small sections are too much. I don't worry too much about that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, my biggest problem for the readability part is in PHP, the necessary this before every function call. That gets annoying.
Yeah, I think That doesn't really bother me anymore. I think I don't even see it at this point. Like I'm just, I don't, maybe I've just been doing it long enough that my brain just naturally tunes that out. But it doesn't bother me. That kind of stuff doesn't really bother me. Like I know Java's real big on that. And it can be confusing sometimes if there isn't a qualifier to tell you what you're actually calling a method on. You're just calling it. But I guess within the context of your method, you should probably know. Hopefully, kind of reminds me of JavaScript that way. But whatever. Adam, is there anything that you found particularly interesting that you want to call out?
It's the big thing that's really important to me throughout this chapter is everything is focused on keep it small, keep it small, keep it small, and that's basically the philosophy of the chapter, and then he carries throughout the chapter and describes how to keep it small in different ways, right? How to keep your functions small and using the various methods of naming and polymorphism and everything else throughout. It was interesting to revisit this. I'd forgotten in the previous reading of the book how he discussed using polymorphism to help pare down switch statements, and that was something that Martin Fowler also talks about in his refactoring book. So it was interesting. I'd forgotten that it was actually in this book as well, and it was a good example to follow through with it.
Yeah, I found it interesting and kind of moderately entertaining when he was talking about that, where how he said something like, if you have to use a switch statement, it should be tucked away, hidden somewhere in a factory, because that's the only possible use case I really approve of for switch statements. I kind of laughed because I've definitely seen some pretty nasty uses and written some pretty nasty uses of switches. So it makes sense, and I get I get the whole keep it small thing. Like I think that theme is important, but I tend to think of it more, for me anyway, as less keep it small and more for keep it understandable. Like if you can't contain something in your head, it's because it's probably too big and it's doing too many things. So you should work on making it understandable rather than focusing too much on, I've got to keep my method signature down because, he said so in Clean Code Chapter 3. There can only be one argument at most. It's just, I feel like forcing it to be small just for the sake of satisfying that, I think is kind of misguided. But looking at, can this be easily understood, I think is a better metric.
Yeah, it all comes down to readability, right? So, we spend a lot more time reading code than we do writing code. So if you keep your methods small and you can tell what they're doing at a glance, then obviously it's going to be faster reading and you're going to get through it a lot more quickly in order to add additional functionality or features.
Or at least hopefully it will be.
Exactly.
Okay, so something that I really liked is he said it in probably the very beginning of the chapter, and he was talking about why functions, like why do you care about keeping functions clean? And he said functions are your first line of organization, and that kind of stood out to me because it's true. Like you're trying to organize thoughts, you're trying to write down how do you. You've got a method that does some action, and then inside the method, the body is telling you how this works. So if you describe it in small functions, you can read how something works, like how something gets accomplished, as opposed to just having a large block of code. And I think the example that he used, the refactoring of that test tool that he had, I think that was a pretty powerful one because it's definitely showing you that you can use functions to better organize how your code is understood and how it's read, and I think that's something that I take away as an important part of this chapter is think of functions as a tool for organizing your thoughts within your code.
Yeah, I think in one section too he talked about how developers and everybody tend to they desire to read from a top-down approach, right? So, and by doing it that way, you can order your functions in kind of a logical way And that also helps with readability. So when you're calling the next step in a function, then you can you can continue just following down through the stack. Of course, it doesn't always work that way because maybe we're calling somewhere else. But for the most part, I mean, it can be a code can be organized in a way so that it is somewhat top down, and it makes it easier to read and easier to follow.
Yep, totally agree with that.
I actually saw a video with him coding and talking about organizing functions, and he said something interesting about he wanted to indent some of the functions, but his editor wouldn't let him. But I think that could be interesting to indent the functions by how they are used. That could give a really good overview when scrolling down a class.
So like have a public function or something at one level, and then its helper methods underneath it.
Yeah, exactly.
Indented over. That would be interesting. That would probably violate every style guide I've ever seen, but that would be interesting.
Yeah, he said that
visually.
too.
Yeah, visually it could be interesting.
Let's see. Something else I found particularly interesting is when he talked about dealing with layers of abstraction, and he said that of something that's very tricky or difficult for people to pick up as programmers is, how do you write a function at a single level of abstraction? I thought that was interesting to look at as a tool for figuring out, are you doing too much inside this function because you're into different levels of abstraction, so you've obviously caused some problem. You shouldn't be doing that. You should let the organization of the code, I guess, naturally allow you to have methods that are at one single layer as opposed to going deeper or higher up the stack. I found that to be an interesting point.
One thing that really jumped out at me toward the end was when he was talking about exceptions, right? And how, an exception is a thing, and if your function is doing that, that's already your one thing. So you can kind of break it out so that way you have one function that is doing that one thing, and it's just then your other functions, they might define the exception, but then at the end, somewhere throughout your stack, you would then call that exception method to actually output that. I mean, I think that could be a little bit extreme, but at the same time, I understand the concept, and it really drove that home of wow, that is one thing. That's exactly right. Well, so if your functions are doing one thing and you're keeping them simple, then you're not doing exceptions in your function.
Yeah, that was one that got me too, because it was, I don't think I'd ever really thought about it too much about, I've got this function and it's, it's doing this thing and handling exceptions of anything that happens from its callers or callees, and I'm like, well, that is true. You are doing multiple things at that point. You're now handling errors, and you're also doing work. So I was like, that's an interesting theory. I don't know that I will adopt that, because I think that would probably mess up how I naturally write things and naturally read them. But I can see that being something to take away, is really think about, everything that your function does, even if it's something that you can logically or very quickly rationalize as not being something that's outside of its bounds, you should take pause and just figure out if that's actually true.
Yeah, I think much of this book so far is he's taking the concepts and taking them to the extremes. So we just to get the thought in our heads. We think about it when we are coding.
It's an effective way of writing, I think.
Yeah, and we can decide if it's worth it or not.
Yeah.
We just need to think about it.
Totally agree with that. I also, right after he went through the whole, I call it the function argument continuum. Is it Niladic, monadic, dyadic. Like after he went through all of that, he started talking about output arguments, and this is something that I hate coming across in code bases. Is you're calling some method or some function, and you're passing in an object, for example, and then that method returns a result to you of some sort, but it also updates the object that you passed in. So you've now got two outputs. Like you now have to understand two different things that this particular method is operating on. And that always drives me crazy because it's very difficult to wrap your head around, even when you have really good tests that happen to explain things out very well, which that's very rare. I will say that, or at least in my experience, it's been very rare that if a method is being tested that changes or modifies a parameter that's passed into it and returns a value, usually those two things are tested in the exact same test, and it's very difficult to break them apart. So if you have tests that actually do break them apart, so they say one specific test tests that the modifications to the argument you passed in are made correctly, and then the other one tests that the return value of the function is correct. Even if you have that, it's still, when you're using that in code, it's very difficult to understand. And so I thought that, him explicitly saying that and saying that, we don't expect that information to be coming out that way, I think that was something useful to say, is, really, really understand why you're modifying the things that are being passed into your function. So be prudent in not doing that unless you absolutely have to, and then try not to even if you do. So that was a cool takeaway for me. Beau, you look like you're itching to say something.
Does PHP have the ability to define arguments as final?
I don't think so.
I know that I ran into that a bunch with Java, and that seemed to be nice because you could define that if I pass this argument in, I know that nobody's going to change it. So you could be upfront about that and help the user realize that what you basically, they're not going to mess around with the objects that you pass in. But I couldn't remember if PHP has it. I know I haven't seen very many people use it if it does exist.
I mean, you can't even specify scalar type, so no, you can't do that.
Yeah, it's kind of the Wild West in PHP. So.
One other thing that I wrote down as being something I definitely agreed with is that flag arguments are ugly, and I wrote it down because it's just a reminder that having Boolean flags on a method almost always means that your function behaves in two different ways based on that flag. Like that's 90% of the time when you have a Boolean flag as an argument, that's what it means. It means I want you to do this, or I want you to do this. So now you've got automatically two paths you have to test and two paths you have to understand, and you have to figure out, am I calling this for some unknown reason? Like I'm passing this true in here. I don't know, like what's going on. So I wrote it down and bolded it as just a reminder: avoid flag arguments, and if you see them, crush them, because they probably are a bad idea in your code base.
Yeah, but I still feel sometimes it gets harder to follow the don't repeat yourself. When I have some things that are almost the same code, then I would make a flag to say if it should do what way it should go or something to avoid the duplication.
Yeah, usually I do stuff like that with some sort of decorator, or you've basically got two behaviors. You want, usually it's something to happen and then something else to happen only if you've done this. So there's ways to write a second method that really captures the behavior that you're trying to express there with the option. and allows you to call that first method and then do your second behavior that way. So it's at that point you've effectively had the same implementation. Like you're now not repeating that same logic that happened in the first method, but you're able to call it now instead of one method with a parameter. Now you've got two separate methods that really capture why you have two separate behaviors. And for me, that's worked most of the time, like for that particular problem. But of course, it depends on what you're doing and how entangled it is, how you would mitigate that particular problem.
That's a tough call. I've used booleans as flags before, as we all have, and there are times when it's just easier to do it that way.
Hey, we're not in this for it to be easier, Adam. We're in this to be cleaner. This is not easy code. This is clean code. No?
So I just recently had the opportunity to refactor a test helper. There was a helper function that had 6 or 7 arguments, and I was put in a situation where I needed to add 2 more. Basically, there were a whole bunch of callbacks that needed to happen, and so I decided to switch to using basically an argument object. And throughout the whole 20 pages talking about 1, 2, 3 arguments, I thought, well, I solved that by doing it all as an argument that was a single object that represented the arguments. I said, but it seems kind of like a cheat. I don't think that counts.
Totally a cheat, yeah.
I liked how he actually mentioned that in the arguments option. He actually mentions it might seem like a cheat, but it's not. So I felt better about that when I saw that, because I thought, I don't know, I must have done something wrong, but yeah. So that was kind of funny that he actually mentions that it might seem like a cheat, but it's not.
I could see it. A lot of times I can see that same pattern as totally being a cheat, though. Like,
yeah.
And I've
lazy with that.
Yeah, I've personally done that where you're like, well, I've got this thing. I kind of need it to be the gatekeeper for my thoughts. So I'm just gonna put this optional array here or whatever, and I'm gonna have listed in the comments. Here's all the things that you can pass in, and it'll do these different things depending on what you pass in. And then at that point, it's undocumented mess essentially, because it's very difficult to call that method or for it to even make sense. And then it's even harder to test and keep the tests relevant and current. So, I can see that pattern working for some cases, but being very dangerous to say, yeah, if you run into the situation, maybe an argument object makes sense. Just try that out for size and see what happens. I can see that being something that I would not tell my coworkers is a good idea.
Yeah. Well, so throughout this whole chapter, I've been working a lot inside a test suite lately, and I feel like the code, the business logic of the code, the project I'm on, is pretty clean for the most part. I mean, it's definitely not perfect, but we don't have these 10 argument functions inside the main code base. Mm-hmm. But I see it a lot in the test suite, and I don't know to what level you would want to work on cleaning up the test suite. Like, I know that having a clean test suite is very important, but I don't get the sense that a lot of people spend a lot of time on it. Yeah. And I don't know how much of this kind of thing would be applicable to that, because the test suites that I've seen are, you'll have like 400 lines of setting up a fixture in one method call, and then at the bottom of the method call it does like 30 assertions with try catch blocks, and I feel like some of this could be applied to that, but I don't know how far you can take it if you're actually building the test suite as opposed to building your actual business logic.
So the advice I used to give people around tests is don't worry about drying up tests, and try to make your tests as straightforward as possible. So that usually lends to examples of have it so that your test actually sets up your mocks, or sets up your data that you're going to test in some way, and then goes into calling things and then verifying things. Like I used to give that advice and say, it's actually detrimental to dry up your test suite significantly, because you end up with something you don't understand where things come from. But recently, and I've taken a different stance on that, because I feel like, yes, I don't think that there should be the same level of investment in keeping your test suite as clean as you would actual, production code, like to the same exact, extent, because I do still feel like there's some benefit from not having as much indirection inside a test suite to figure out where things came from and how they're built up. But at the same time, your test suite is also your production code. Like it is all production code. It is all something that you're expected other people to maintain, you're expected to maintain. So you should give it the same level of care and thought that you do to the production code that is actually going to run your app. And so if you get to the point where you're looking at something that is a giant holy mess of, 300 lines of setup and then 40 lines of try catches with assertions here and there, that's a problem. Like that's something that people are not going to maintain. Like nobody wants to read that. Nobody wants to deal with it. So when it breaks, what happens? They comment it out. They delete it. They say, oh, well, this particular section was probably duplicating something, so I'm not really worried about it, because they can't understand it. So it goes back to that whole, is your code broken up into sections and components that you understand, or is it not? Like, yeah, I think you should definitely keep your code base as clean as possible for understanding. But that's just my opinion. Other people are free to disagree with that. I think Adam is disagreeing with it right now.
No, I'm not really disagreeing. Actually, I'm thinking, a good deal that is he kind of covered, although he wasn't talking specifically about tests, which he didn't really talk specifically about tests throughout the chapter, but I think that a lot of that comes down to the one section on with no side effects, right? So, when you're looking at a test, each of the different assertions and the possible failure is a side effect. So, but bringing it back to the code versus the testing, because that we could go into that discussion all day. But I like the section where he talked about no side effects, and he brought it home where, based on the user credentials being validated, then it's creating the session, right? And we do that all the time, but seeing it actually portrayed as, that is a side effect of the user logging in. It's not the user logging in. If once the user's logged in, then you need to somehow create the session afterwards, but not necessarily in the same method, right? And I like that idea.
Yeah, that one was checking a password, right? I think that was
the
specific example he used. Was there was a check password method, and it just happened to also reset your session.
Right.
And it's like, who thought this was a good idea? Like that's obviously not something that is ideal at all.
But even so, you could still carry that even a step further and say, okay, should I create a session all the time whenever I'm doing anything password related? I mean, I understand if you have a login function, the login, obviously you're going to create a session at that point and add the user's credentials to it, whatever the case might be. But other than that, your session activity, it may pay to actually break that out a little bit. I mean, a session is kind of just one thing, right? There's many other things like maybe sending emails or something like that could also be a side effect, throughout a web-based application that, it might pay dividends to look into breaking that out versus keeping it as a side effect.
Yeah. Totally agree. Let's see, what else did I write down here? I did find it interesting when he was talking about the size of things, and he was giving the reference for why the 72 characters, why why the rules that, and he's like, we're not constrained by technology anymore. Like you can say, oh, a function is to fit on a screen. He's like, today that can be, 150 lines. It's very easy to have that are all 200 characters wide. Like it's very easy to do that now. But just because we're not constrained by the technology, just because we don't have ancient monitors with very terrible resolution, it doesn't give us the free rein to just write whatever we want and say, well, it fits on my screen. Like this is the argument that I think would be awesome for a style guide or for a joke style guide to have is, it must be, it can only be one screen long and one screen wide as your measure for your style guide, and then just see what happens, because it'd be very easy to have very small font and have a very long and wide method, and then have a larger font and have a very short one. So I think it was good for that discussion. I think that kind of helped bring the seriousness to, I'm sitting here joking about it and talking about seriousness, but bring the seriousness to why are we talking about function size. And it used to have been because of these screens, and maybe that's where the numbers came from, but the end goal, I think, is more important, which is the readability of your code and the understandability, the quick understanding of your code. So just don't focus on the specifics of the rules, because the stories are probably humorous as to why they exist. Focus on the outcome and why we're doing that.
I have this vision of developers adjusting the resolution of their screen so they can fit more code in one screen. there, I've got it. I can fit 200 lines on my screen. I'm good to go.
Pull request in with screenshot attached to prove that I definitely did fit this in one screen.
Yeah. And submit it to Grumpy.
Yeah.
So throughout the chapter, I actually had one recurring thought. He talked a lot about putting things in instance variables in some cases to make things easier, and so that you weren't always passing around objects or arguments, rather. And I sort of felt like that was a cheat. And I sort of feel like that leads to stateful objects that I wouldn't ordinarily want to create. And I don't see that that was addressed at all as to how to avoid that, or if that's a problem or not.
But didn't he follow that up with saying to create a factory and pass that in? I think there was one line in there he kind of hit it in.
Maybe I missed that. But I'm still not sure how that would work either. I mean,
then you're passing in an object from the factory and be able to carry that through throughout. I'm not sure. I'm just saying. I remember there was one place where he was talking about something along that line, and then all of a sudden he threw in a quick one-liner, saying, "Well, you could do that in a factory, or by passing in an object of a factory."
Yeah. I guess I'll have to read that again. But that was one of the things that I was thinking about, was that a lot of this talked about using instance variables to help bypass these really long argument requirements of, well, you don't have to pass it on as an argument, just make it an instance variable. And that kind of feels like it goes against my instincts to only make things instance variables that really are instance variables, not just because you don't want to pass function arguments. To me, that feels kind of lazy, and I feel like a lot of test suites will do that. They will, completely bloat their base God class that has their document manager, their entity manager, or whatever, and just have these variables that all of the tests can use for convenience, but sort of cause problems when you start relying on them being there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like part of the argument that he's making kind of applies the concept that, you don't really care how things, or you shouldn't know or care from the outside how things are implemented internally. Like, you don't really care where or how it knows that this particular variable should be this particular value. Like, you don't actually need to keep track of how that's done. But yeah, I can definitely see your point that it is, if you're doing it solely, if you're like, I'm going to throw this in as this variable just because you don't want to pass something around, I can see that's totally a cheat. You're cheating something. Like, it's not it's not a part of that particular object's state. Like it's not a requirement for that object to exist. It's just there because you're lazy or you are trying to obey these rules about not having too many arguments or whatever. But at the same time, I feel like that's an implementation detail internal. Like that's something that you have to weigh with your particular goals of the design that you're making. Like if you need to pass something around in an instance variable, knock yourself out. Like it's okay. It's an internal instance variable. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't know the answer to your question, but I have some sort of opinion on it.
All right. But nobody else was troubled by that notion.
I didn't personally pick up on that, so I think I'm going to go back and read through the chapter again and see if I can catch that.
I also thought about it, but I read it as it was mostly when you're passing variables down along more than one function as arguments, then it would make sense to put it as an instance variable instead of passing it through the functions to where it's needed or something.
Yeah, I think that was the context that it was given in. So I think that was what he was getting at, but it still seems to go against my instincts. Just because if you start setting stuff on instance variables, then you're setting dependencies that the function that you're calling into now assumes that you've set something correctly, but someone else could later call that function that has a dependency on you having set this instance variable that they haven't set yet. And they won't know from the outside. And sure, it might be an internal implementation detail to the user of your public API, but another developer on your internal API looking at your class may not realize that, for example, you need to have set the document manager on this before you call into this other function that doesn't give any indication that it even needs it from the outside. So anyway, it was something that maybe it's something that he'll go into later in future chapters. That was just one of the things that popped out at me as I didn't really felt was resolved very well in this chapter.
Yeah, I can see what you mean.
I think the answer is to always just shove everything into globals, and you don't have to pass it in as an argument at that point, right?
Exactly.
That's bad advice to anyone who's listening. That's a joke. Do not do that, please.
It's neither easy or clean code.
Yeah, that's just bad code. I think I could write that book. I mean, other things that I wrote down are just, kind of repetition from the previous chapter, which is, don't be afraid of making long names. Like, obviously don't go too crazy, but because that could be an indication that you're doing too many things. You've got extreme compound names, but it says long and descriptive is better than short and enigmatic, and I think that's it's a good point. It's, name things as long as the name needs to be to understand what's going on. Don't get too caught up in that. And I know, so I'm going to rag on Code Climate a little bit, but Code Climate sometimes complains about the length of names of variables and such, and I always laugh when I see that, because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I can see that sometimes being a problem, but it's not. If the name tells me exactly why that's there, I would much rather it be too long for Code Climate's taste than I would for someone to shorten it or put some abbreviations in there, take out some words just because they want to satisfy, a computer program that's checking code. I would much rather understand it than the computer program. I don't care if the program understands. It doesn't make a difference to me as long as I can understand it. That's what's important. So I thought that was good that he brought that up, and then he also said, be consistent in your naming of functions. Don't, try to stay away from the words that mean the same things in your function names, and don't confuse people. Like, don't purposely confuse people or accidentally by naming something that's not consistent with the pattern everywhere else in your code base, just because you feel like this name is better or you got tired of typing the other word or whatever. Just be consistent in how you're naming things. Makes everyone happy.
I got nothing.
You got nothing. All right, cool. Did anybody have anything that they disagreed with in this chapter?
Oh, before that, the last section before the conclusion, where he compares it to writing. I also think that's interesting. He does that a lot. Compares it to other things that actually are considered a craft of some sort.
Yeah.
Where he talks about you start by writing a draft and clean it up and massage it until you like the result.
And then you passed it off to your tech reviewer, who comes back and says that your book is terrible and you should probably not be writing it. Yeah, I totally just like writing. But yeah, I think I actually follow that pattern of, rough draft. Not exactly, but I usually sit down and say, okay, I know this is the particular problem I'm trying to solve. Let me just hack something together, and I'll sit there and play with something. And I usually go through one or two, iterations of that. Then once I get something that helps me better understand the solution I was thinking of, then I say, okay, cool. Now I can take this and actually turn it into code instead of just this hobbled together system of statements. And, refactor it out, break things out, extract things, rename stuff, so on and so forth, until I get to something that I feel is ready for someone else to understand. And that's when I put it up for code review, and we talk and chat and go over things. And so, yeah, I think that's very similar to how I should write everything, but never end up actually writing my blog posts in that way or anything. But I should totally do that. I should totally follow the exact same pattern of, hey, I'm gonna write this post out, then I'm gonna edit it and pare it down into a clean thing. What I usually end up doing for writing is, here, let me write a bunch of words. That's a whole lot of words. All right, I'm just going to publish this and hope that nobody notices the inconsistencies and grammar mistakes and such. So,
yeah, I'm exactly the same. I'm more I'm looking over my code many more times than I am when I'm writing.
Which is funny, because it's like it is, as he was saying, it's very similar. It's similar in nature, I think. Like, it's, you're writing code, you're constructing statements into a grammar, and then you're making them work together to fulfill a thought and essentially prove a theory that you've come up with. So, I mean, I can see it. I can see there being a parallel between writing code and writing.
Yeah, for people who are writing text like in the same way we are writing code, I think they can be compared, but maybe not when we are writing text.
Probably not. Okay, so anything anyone disagrees with? Or do we all agree with everything he said? Besides your question, Beau.
Yeah, the only potential disagreement or issue that I had was resolving the instant variable question. But otherwise, it all sounded really reasonable and great things to keep in mind.
Well, I'm glad we could help you resolve that then.
Yeah, I looked at that really quickly, and yeah, you're right. He really doesn't address that. He uses it as an example of, instead of passing a variable around, just using an instance variable, but then he doesn't actually go back and clean that up afterwards. So I'm kind of curious to how he would handle that, a different way.
Mm-hmm.
How would you handle that a different way?
Well, I would pass it along as a argument. is what I have been doing. Try to keep, if I'm going for creating a stateful function or a stateless function, I'm going to pass in everything that I need to use. I'll do that often if I'm creating a simple helper function or something that maybe it's a static. It doesn't even have access to the object, or it doesn't have access to the instance. I'll pass things in that I need as dependencies and pass them around. So I guess one potential thing would be to abuse maybe the argument option, or the argument object, and fill it up with the dependencies that are needed. But I think that starts to go into the gray area that Jeff was talking about earlier as probably being an abuse of that pattern.
See, it's a slippery slope.
Yeah, it is. but it would be a way to do it, but I don't know if it's a good way.
Yeah.
And that too, it's I think making it an instance variable, like he said, is it's always going to remain that, right?
Mm.
Whereas if you're making multiple calls throughout the stack and you're passing it as a variable, it allows the opportunity for change. It allows that variable then to be available to be changed. So that's kind of something. Again, I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just completely hypothesizing and trying to visualize what he's meaning as or how he's thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty open.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking could come from this would be creating an object that represents that function, and then all of its subcomponents or whatever could be, private methods on some object that's sole purpose is to perform that function. But I didn't see him say that specifically. Basically, take a method on your object, extract it out into its own class, whose sole job is to execute that function by splitting it out into a bunch of private methods that can be called internally. And now, rather than passing arguments to this method on an object, you're instead passing in just a couple of things, and stuff gets shoveled off into this whole other object, and it does the work for you. In which case, you have a throwaway object that can be stateful for the duration of executing one call to what had previously been a method. But that just seems like a lot of work. And I didn't see him say that specifically. So I don't know. That was the other thing I had considered, but it wasn't discussed in the chapter itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. I could see where it could be. I could see, as far as an instance variable goes, I could see where that could be substituted for a dependency injection container or a service, and then you're passing that value throughout the application using a service or something along that line. But then you're talking about a much larger stack than a single class or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Or middleware, something like that, something along that line.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Cool. Well, I didn't have anything that I disagreed with in this chapter, so I'm afraid I'm too agreeable.
Yeah, same here.
All right, cool. So is there any parting words anyone has? Adam, do you have any parting words?
Keep things small. Keep your functions small. And, I'm looking forward to the next chapter.
It's comments, right? I think we're doing comments next.
Yeah.
I think that's what it was.
I hate comments.
Well,
I love having comments. I hate that most people do them wrong.
From what I remember of this book, I don't think that Uncle Bob feels too strongly about comments either. So
I think he's a proponent from other talks that I've heard. I think he's a proponent of comments. He's not a fan of comments used to explain bad code.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. He's actually really, really against comments, as far as I have heard.
Yeah, but now we're getting ahead of ourselves of what we're going to be talking about next time.
All right. Beau, any parting words that you have? Words of
Naming
wisdom?
is still important.
Yes.
It's an extension of last chapter. In fact, some points had been reiterated from chapter 2 on making sure names are important. So.
Totally agree. Martin?
Yeah, it's the same. Keeping things small and keeping them smaller than that.
I like that sentence. I like the way he said that.
Yeah.
Keep them small, and then the rule number 2 is keep them smaller than that. That was awesome.
You're never done keeping it small. Yeah.
Yeah.
And my parting words are: don't use Boolean flags in your functions, please. Every time you do, a kitten dies. That's
Please
my
don't.
advice. All right, so that was chapter 3 of Clean Code. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Adam, Beau, and Martin, for participating tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about comments, chapter 4 of Clean Code. I hope I'll see you there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for hosting.
You're welcome. It is my pleasure.